Hey dudes, long before weather apps or Doppler radar, farmers had to get creative. In early Canada, some folks swore by frogs. If they croaked louder, climbed higher, or just disappeared, it meant something was coming. Rain, storms, maybe just a shift in the air. These farmers watched the world around them closely. And sometimes, that meant trusting a frog more than the sky. Tonight, we're slowing it all down and heading to a muddy field beside an old log cabin where someone's looking to the frogs for answers. If weird, slow history helps you rest, hit like and subscribe. And tell me, what's the strangest weather sign you've ever heard? Now dim the lights. Let the frogs sing in your mind and drift back to a time when nature was the only forecast. Early Canadian farmers, living in harmony with nature, developed various methods to predict the weather, often relying on creatures like frogs to give them clues about the changing skies. Frogs, known for their sensitivity to the environment, were the unexpected weather forecasters in rural Canada. But how exactly did they know when rain was coming? Frogs are creatures of habit, and their behavior could be influenced by atmospheric pressure, humidity, and other weather factors. This fascinating observation system was not unique to Canada. Similar practices were used in various cultures around the world. Farmers watched for changes in frog calls, particularly noting how the frequency and intensity of their croaks could shift when storms approached. These behaviors were subtle, but for those who took the time to listen and observe, they served as reliable indicators. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a farmer in rural Canada, standing near the edge of a pond at dusk, listening intently to the chorus of frogs. The air is thick with the scent of earth and wet leaves, the sky gradually darkening. You notice a sudden silence before the croaks start up again, louder and more frequent. Could this be the sign of an approaching rainstorm? Or was it just an ordinary night for the frogs? In the quiet, damp evenings of early Canadian life, farmers had honed an intuitive understanding of their environment. This relationship wasn't born out of scientific knowledge as we know it today, but rather through years of observation and trial and error. Frogs were more than just creatures hopping around ponds. They were part of a complex natural system that many early settlers could read like an open book. The croaks and calls of frogs, it turned out, were influenced by environmental factors that could forecast changes in the weather. Research has shown that frogs, particularly species like the wood frog, are highly sensitive to changes in humidity, temperature, and barometric pressure. When rain is imminent, these factors change rapidly, signaling the frogs to increase their vocal activity. For farmers, the timing and nature of these sounds became more than just background noise. It became a signpost. On a stormy evening, the frogs' increased activity was their way of communicating that rain was near, a valuable cue for farmers who needed to prepare their crops, livestock, and even their own homes for the coming storm. But this wasn't just a random occurrence. Frogs react to subtle changes in their environment, such as a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. The change in pressure can make them feel a slight disturbance, compelling them to croak louder or more frequently. Farmers, who had learned to interpret these calls, knew when it was time to harvest, when to bring the livestock into shelters, or when to delay work in the fields. These small signals, seemingly insignificant to most people, became part of their daily decision-making. What's even more interesting is the interplay between frogs and the surrounding ecosystem. The frogs themselves were often indicators of larger environmental changes. The health of the frog population could tell a farmer more than just weather patterns. It was also a reflection of the overall health of the land. If frogs were flourishing, the moisture levels in the soil were likely optimal for crops, signaling good times ahead. If the frogs were silent or retreating, it could indicate that drought conditions were setting in. As decades passed and the world changed, so too did the practices of early Canadian farmers. The advent of modern weather forecasting methods eventually supplanted these ancient intuitive techniques. However, the knowledge of how frogs could predict rain never fully disappeared. It was passed down, like many other forgotten practices, to the next generation, tucked away in the memories of older farmers or local legends. Yet, in an age of satellites and advanced meteorology, few paid attention to the croaks of frogs, despite their proven ability to give warning signs long before technology could. Interestingly, though, there's a certain beauty to these old methods. They were simple yet effective, reliant on the sharp senses of animals and the careful observation of their surroundings. This knowledge didn't come from textbooks or meteorological tools. It was passed through generations by those who had a deep connection to the land and a profound understanding of nature's rhythms. In a way, the reliance on frogs and other natural cues was the original weather app, a system designed by nature itself. For the modern-day farmer, it's easy to overlook these practices, relying on weather forecasts provided by technology. But the methods of frog forecasting are still respected by those who live close to nature. There's a growing movement among organic and small-scale farmers to reconnect with these time-tested methods of weather prediction as part of a broader interest in sustainability and working with the land in a more holistic way. In fact, some farmers still listen for the frog's croaks during the spring months, using them as a secondary source of information to guide their decisions. The subtlety and accuracy of the frog's calls are hard to match with modern technology in some rural areas, where satellite signals may be weak and weather apps can't always give the nuanced predictions that a keen ear can hear in nature. This technique, once vital to the survival of farmers, serves as a reminder of how deeply our ancestors were in tune with the natural world around them. Despite the advancement of technology, we might find value in returning to some of these old methods, rediscovering knowledge that modern science is just beginning to understand. As we continue to advance in technology and change the way we interact with the environment, are we losing valuable connections with the world around us? Could the forgotten methods of our ancestors, like frog forecasting, hold insights we might use to live more sustainably today? Long before the establishment of large-scale syrup production in Canada, the indigenous peoples of the region had mastered the art of harvesting maple syrup. The practice was deeply intertwined with their daily lives, spiritual beliefs, and seasonal cycles. For centuries, indigenous tribes such as the Algonquin, the Iroquois, and the Ojibwa perfected the process, which was a crucial part of their winter-to-spring transition. Maple syrup harvesting began in the early spring, when the days warmed just enough to cause the sap in the sugar maples to flow. The syrup itself was a vital food source, providing the necessary sugars that would sustain the community after a long, harsh winter. The early steps of the process were surprisingly simple, yet effective, relying on nature's cues and careful, meticulous work. The method was direct. Small taps were driven into the trunks of the sugar maples, and the sap would drip into containers made from birch bark or wooden buckets. The sap itself was mostly water with a slight sweetness, requiring hours of boiling to concentrate the sugars and create the thick, rich syrup that would become a staple of both their diet and trade. However, it wasn't just about the syrup itself. The entire process was marked by a careful relationship with the trees. The indigenous peoples would never take too much sap from a single tree, ensuring that the tree would continue to thrive. This sustainable practice allowed for generations of maple syrup harvests without depleting the sugar maple population. But how did the indigenous peoples discover that these trees could produce sap in the first place? It is believed that the discovery was likely an accident, perhaps the result of a storm that broke a branch, causing sap to spill out. Regardless of how it started, the knowledge of maple syrup harvesting quickly spread, becoming an essential part of their survival. As settlers arrived, they were introduced to this practice and began to adapt it to their needs, setting the foundation for the maple syrup industry that would eventually make Canada one of the world's leading producers of maple syrup. As settlers arrived in Canada, they were introduced to the rich tradition of maple syrup harvesting by the Indigenous peoples. At first, they simply adopted the practices they observed, using similar tools like wooden buckets and birch bark containers to collect the sap. However, settlers began to make adjustments that would eventually lead to the modern maple syrup industry. One of the first major innovations was the development of the metal spile, a metal tap that replaced the wooden spiles used by the Indigenous people. This new technology allowed settlers to collect sap more efficiently, as the metal tap could be inserted deeper into the tree, providing a more reliable flow of sap. The metal spile would later evolve, with settlers experimenting with different designs to maximize sap yield. In addition to the metal spile, settlers also introduced the practice of boiling the sap over an open fire, a method borrowed from their European ancestors. This was a significant departure from the traditional practice of boiling sap in smaller pots, as it allowed for the syrup to be produced in larger quantities. By the early 19th century, sugaring operations had become larger, with families and communities coming together to tap dozens, sometimes hundreds of trees. The boiling process itself was a careful art. While the Indigenous people had used wood-burning fires, the settlers used iron cauldrons and later, specialized sugar shacks with large evaporator pans. These changes made the process more efficient, allowing for the large-scale production of maple syrup. However, despite these innovations, the quality of the syrup was still closely tied to the weather. A freeze-thaw cycle, where the temperatures alternated between freezing nights and warm days, was essential for sap flow. Without this natural rhythm, there would be no maple syrup. Moreover, settlers began to trade maple syrup with other settlers and Indigenous peoples, eventually creating an industry that spread throughout Canada. The syrup became more than just a food source. It was also a valuable commodity that helped settlers trade with one another. By the mid-19th century, maple syrup had become a symbol of Canadian identity, with sugar shacks dotting the landscape and local festivals celebrating the harvest. As the 20th century approached, the process of maple syrup harvesting underwent a profound transformation. What had once been a small community-focused practice evolved into a major commercial industry, largely driven by the advent of new technologies and increased demand for maple products. The rise of large-scale maple syrup farms marked a significant shift from the traditional, more sustainable methods of the past. With the advent of metal tubing systems in the early 20th century, sap collection became more efficient. Instead of relying on hundreds of individual buckets hanging from trees, farmers began to run long stretches of tubing directly from the taps to central collection tanks. This system allowed them to tap more trees and gather sap faster, which was essential as the demand for maple syrup grew. The sap could now be collected more efficiently, and the cost of production decreased, making maple syrup a more commercially viable product. However, the shift toward larger-scale production came with its own set of challenges. As maple syrup production grew, it became more industrialized. Large factories began to emerge, and the personal, artisanal touch of the smaller family-operated sugar shacks began to fade. The syrup that had once been carefully boiled in small batches over wood-burning fires was now mass-produced in enormous evaporators. While this allowed for greater production, It also meant that the syrup was sometimes produced faster and with less attention to quality. The larger industry also created competition. With the rise of commercial maple syrup production, the traditional practices of the smaller farmers who tapped just a few trees and boiled their sap in small cauldrons began to feel threatened. Commercial syrup manufacturers, particularly in Quebec, where the majority of Canada's maple syrup is produced, began to dominate the market. This shift affected the local economy, pushing smaller farms out and making it harder for independent syrup makers to thrive. Despite the changes brought on by commercialization, the legacy of the original maple syrup harvesters has not been forgotten. Today, many small-scale maple syrup producers continue to operate using traditional methods passed down from their ancestors. These producers often emphasize the importance of sustainable practices, tapping trees in ways that protect the long-term health of the maple forests. The commercial maple syrup industry has also adapted, with many large producers focusing on organic certification and ensuring that the syrup is produced with minimal environmental impact. Additionally, maple syrup remains a symbol of Canadian culture, often seen as a quintessential product of the country's history and identity. Festivals celebrating the maple harvest continue to draw crowds, and local producers are still highly respected for their commitment to quality. Final reflection. As we continue to consume maple syrup in various forms, from drizzling it over pancakes to using it as an ingredient in numerous recipes, there's a sense of connection to the past, the quiet and sometimes overlooked work of early farmers and indigenous peoples shaped not only the industry, but also the way we relate to the land around us. Could the shift from small-scale production to commercialization in other industries offer insights into the balance between tradition and modernization? In the early days of Canadian settlement, travel was an arduous and often perilous task. The land was vast and largely untamed, with little in the way of infrastructure to aid those trying to get from one place to another. The settlers who made their way across Canada's rugged terrain faced numerous challenges, none greater than the state of the roads, or rather the lack of them. The concept of roads in the early days was a far cry from the well-paved highways we are familiar with today. In most places, roads were little more than muddy paths, winding through dense forests or over swampy terrain. During the spring thaw or after heavy rains, these paths became nearly impassable, turning into deep, sticky mud that could trap wagons and horses for days. Travel that might have taken a few hours in ideal conditions could stretch into days, or even weeks of grueling effort. For settlers making their way into the interior of Canada, the roads, if you could even call them that, were often no more than rudimentary tracks carved out of the wilderness by the first few travelers. These early roads didn't have the luxury of solid foundations or drainage systems. As a result, they were prone to flooding, erosion, and becoming overgrown with vegetation. Only the most determined or desperate ventured along these paths, which often led to small settlements or isolated homesteads. One of the most infamous examples of early Canadian roads was the Long Road, a path that connected early settlements in Quebec to Ontario. While it was crucial for trade and settlement expansion, it was also known for its treacherous conditions. Travelers often found themselves bogged down in thick mud, and the journey could take days longer than expected due to the constant need to navigate around flooded areas or clear fallen trees. But despite the difficulties, these roads served as lifelines to the settlers who relied on them for survival and communication. The challenges of these roads were not limited to settlers. Traders, soldiers, and government officials had to contend with them as well. Even during the fur trade era, when waterways were often the preferred means of transportation, Goods had to be carried overland by pack animals or sleds, and the state of the roads could make this incredibly slow and costly. As the settlers of early Canada confronted the challenges of mud-filled paths and impassable roads, they had no choice but to innovate and adapt. These early pioneers developed a variety of techniques and tools to navigate the rough terrain, ensuring that trade, communication, and the movement of people continued, even in the face of adversity. One of the most significant innovations came in the form of the sled. In areas where roads were too muddy for wagons, settlers turned to sleds, which were more effective at gliding over snow and softer ground. These sleds, often pulled by oxen or horses, could carry larger loads than traditional carts, and they became essential during the long winters, when roads were often buried under snow. The sleds allowed settlers to transport supplies, firewood, and other necessities to and from their homes, even when the roads were too treacherous for traditional vehicles. In addition to sleds, settlers began to use the canoe as a primary means of transportation. Given Canada's vast network of rivers and lakes, this mode of transport became an indispensable part of early Canadian life. Canoes were lightweight, easy to maneuver, and perfect for traversing the waterways that crisscrossed the landscape. They also allowed settlers to avoid the worst of the muddy roads, taking advantage of Canada's natural features to travel more efficiently. Many early settlers would use a combination of canoes, sleds, and on-foot travel to complete their journeys. As the need for better transportation solutions grew, settlers also began to develop corduroy roads, primitive roads made by laying logs, side by side across a muddy or swampy path. While these roads weren't ideal, they helped provide a stable surface for wagons and carts, particularly in areas where natural obstacles made it impossible to lay a more traditional road. The logs helped raise the roadbed above the mud and water, providing a firmer foundation for travel. However, corduroy roads were still prone to rot, and their effectiveness was often temporary, especially in the wet Canadian climate. Beyond physical innovations, the settlers also adapted their strategies for travel. Traveling in groups became a common practice, particularly during the wet seasons. Settlers would form small convoys to share resources, protect one another from wild animals, and assist each other when their wagons or sleds became bogged down in the mud. This sense of community and mutual aid was critical for survival in such a harsh environment. They also developed methods of staggered travel, where travelers would set out at different times, ensuring that there was always someone nearby to assist if things went wrong. Despite these innovations, life on the muddy roads was still incredibly difficult. For every success story of settlers overcoming the terrain, there were countless others where individuals became stuck, lost, or exhausted. The constant battle with the roads was a reminder of the early hardships settlers faced as they attempted to tame the wilderness. As the 19th century progressed and Canada began to grow, the conditions of its roads and the methods used to navigate them remained a key factor in shaping the country's development. Despite the hardships and difficulties, the continuous improvement in transportation infrastructure laid the groundwork for Canada's expansion across its vast and varied landscapes. One of the most pivotal developments during this time was the construction of railroads. The completion of the Intercolonial Railway in the 1860s and the more famous Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, in 1885 helped overcome the limitations imposed by the muddy and inaccessible roads. The construction of the CPR was a monumental achievement, connecting the eastern and western parts of the country and making it possible to move goods, settlers, and resources more efficiently than ever before. The completion of this railway not only revolutionized transportation, but also cemented the idea of Canadian unity and national identity. The success of the railroads also had a ripple effect on the development of cities and towns. As the trains began to link communities, new hubs of commerce and culture began to emerge. Settlements that had once been isolated due to poor road conditions now became key players in the national economy. Cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver experienced rapid growth, transforming from small outposts into bustling urban centers. The railways allowed for the mass transportation of people and goods, boosting trade, industry, and immigration. However, the impact of Canada's difficult roads and the drive to overcome them was not limited to transportation. The challenges settlers faced also contributed to a unique Canadian spirit, one of resilience, creativity, and determination. The need to adapt to the harsh environment fostered a culture of innovation and community building that became a hallmark of Canada's early history. The same resourcefulness that helped settlers navigate muddy roads was applied to farming, industry, and even governance. The legacy of those early muddy roads is still present today in the country's vast infrastructure. While the railroads provided a major leap forward, the foundation for Canada's modern road systems was laid by the perseverance of early settlers. Today, the country boasts a well-connected network of highways and byways that continue to link remote areas to urban centers, enabling the smooth flow of goods, services, and people across one of the largest landmasses in the world. As we look back on the journey of early Canadian settlers, it's clear that the struggle with the land, particularly with the roads, played a critical role in shaping the nation. The way these early travelers navigated the wilderness created a foundation for the modern Canada we know today. Could the challenges they faced serve as a reminder of the importance of perseverance and innovation in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles? The Canadian fur trade is one of the most important aspects of early Canadian history. It laid the foundation for the nation's economy and was a key driver in its exploration and expansion. But the fur trade didn't start with the arrival of settlers. It began long before, with the indigenous peoples who had been trading furs with one another for centuries. It was their knowledge of the land, the animals, and the seasons that would prove invaluable when European traders arrived in Canada. In the early 1600s, French and English explorers began to venture into the Canadian wilderness, seeking to establish trading relationships with indigenous tribes. The fur-bearing animals of Canada, especially beavers, were in high demand in Europe for their pelts, which were used to make hats, clothing, and other goods. What started as small exchanges between the indigenous peoples and European explorers quickly grew into a lucrative and complex industry. The indigenous tribes, who had long relied on the resources of the land for survival, understood the natural world in ways that Europeans did not. They knew where the fur-bearing animals lived, how to trap them, and how to prepare the pelts for trade. In exchange for furs, the Europeans offered goods such as metal tools, firearms, and other manufactured items. This trade was mutually beneficial, at least at first, as it provided the indigenous peoples with new tools and trade goods, while offering Europeans access to a vital resource. However, this new trade brought with it significant challenges. The terrain was harsh, the weather was unpredictable, and the fur trade itself was cutthroat, with competing European companies vying for dominance. In addition, the diseases brought by European settlers devastated indigenous populations, and the fur trade began to alter traditional ways of life. Despite these hardships, the fur trade continued to grow, driven by the resilience and ingenuity of both the indigenous peoples and the European settlers. Trading posts were established across the country, from Quebec in the east to the Pacific coast in the west. The Hudson's Bay Company, established in 1670, became one of the most prominent players in the fur trade, controlling vast stretches of land and waterways. These posts served as hubs for the exchange of goods, and became the lifeblood of early Canadian commerce. As the fur trade expanded throughout Canada, so did the struggles associated with it. For European settlers and traders, survival in the Canadian wilderness was a constant battle. The vast, uncharted landscapes, treacherous weather, and the risk of conflict with indigenous tribes made the fur trade a dangerous and exhausting venture. But despite these challenges, the fur trade endured, thanks to the resilience and adaptability of those involved. One of the most remarkable aspects of the fur trade was the role played by the voyageurs. These were French-Canadian paddlers who navigated the long, dangerous rivers and lakes of Canada, transporting goods between trading posts. The voyageurs were incredibly skilled, enduring long hours of travel in extreme weather conditions, often paddling through freezing waters and snowstorms. They carried heavy loads of furs, trade goods, and provisions, sometimes covering thousands of miles over the course of a year. Their strength, endurance, and commitment were essential to the success of the fur trade, and they became a symbol of the relentless spirit required to thrive in the harsh Canadian wilderness. In addition to the voyageurs, the fur trade also relied heavily on indigenous knowledge and expertise. Indigenous peoples, particularly the Cree, Ojibwa, and Algonquin, were integral to the fur trade. They taught European settlers and traders how to navigate the land, hunt and trap animals, and survive in the unforgiving environment. Indigenous trappers and hunters were responsible for providing the majority of the pelts traded, and their expertise in the wilderness allowed the fur trade to flourish. However, the relationship between European traders and indigenous peoples was far from simple. While the fur trade initially brought mutual benefits, tensions began to arise as European demands grew, and the arrival of settlers further strained indigenous communities. The fur trade began to disrupt traditional lifestyles, and the introduction of European goods and diseases had a profound impact on indigenous societies. The fur trade also led to competition and conflict between different indigenous groups, as they competed for access to valuable trading posts and resources. The commercial nature of the fur trade also had consequences. The rise of large companies, like the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, meant that much of the fur trade was controlled by a few powerful organizations, leaving indigenous trappers and smaller traders at the mercy of these companies. The monopolies created by these trading companies often led to unfair trading practices, and many indigenous groups found themselves at a disadvantage. The fur trade, while thriving for over 2 centuries, eventually began to decline in the mid-19th century. Several factors contributed to this decline, marking the end of an era for Canada's fur trade economy. One of the most significant reasons was the overhunting of fur-bearing animals, particularly beavers, which led to a reduction in the availability of high-quality pelts. As beaver populations dwindled, the demand for fur shifted, and the fur trade could no longer sustain the level of commerce it once had. Additionally, industrialization and the growth of new markets further disrupted the fur trade. The arrival of more settlers and the establishment of agricultural communities, especially in the fertile regions of southern Canada, shifted focus away from fur-bearing animals and towards farming and other industries. The growing influence of railroads, which made the transportation of goods more efficient, also diminished the need for the old trading routes used by fur traders. The decline of the fur trade had profound effects on both the economy and the indigenous communities that had been integral to it. As the fur trade companies like Hudson's Bay and the Northwest Company faded in prominence, indigenous peoples found themselves increasingly marginalized in the rapidly changing economic landscape. With fewer opportunities in the fur trade, many indigenous communities were forced to turn to other means of survival, including agriculture, but often found their lands and traditional ways of life being encroached upon by settlers. The fur trade also played a significant role in the formation of Canadian borders. As trading posts spread across the country, they helped establish early settlement patterns and encouraged exploration. These posts, along with the fur trade's infrastructure, marked the foundation for Canada's eventual westward expansion. The networks of rivers, lakes, and ports used by fur traders would later become critical for the development of Canadian transportation systems. Despite the fur trade's decline, its legacy continues to shape Canadian culture today. It laid the foundation for Canada's commercial and cultural identity, from the establishment of major cities like Montreal and Winnipeg to the development of Canada's political structure. The interactions between European settlers and Indigenous peoples during this time also had lasting consequences for relations between the two groups, leading to both cooperation and conflict, some of which persists to this day. In modern times, the fur trade is often remembered as a significant chapter in Canadian history, not only for its economic impact, but also for the way it shaped the nation's identity. The rugged explorers, resilient voyageurs, and Indigenous trappers who once carved paths through Canada's vast wilderness are now seen as the pioneers who laid the groundwork for the country's growth. The fur trade's role in shaping Canada cannot be overstated. It was both a time of prosperity and conflict, and its legacy can still be seen in Canada's economy, culture, and its ongoing relationship with Indigenous peoples. How do we reconcile the importance of the fur trade with the complex history of colonization and its lasting effects on Indigenous communities? In the early days of Canadian settlement, survival was often precarious, and every resource had to be used wisely. One of the most important and revered resources for early settlers was wheat. Wheat wasn't just a crop, it was a lifeline. Early Canadians understood the value of this grain and its potential to sustain them through harsh winters. But to make sure that no grain was ever wasted, they had to develop creative and efficient ways of cultivating, harvesting, and storing wheat. The first wheat crops in Canada were introduced by French settlers in the early 1600s. The French brought their knowledge of agriculture with them, along with wheat seeds from Europe. However, the Canadian climate presented challenges. The harsh winters, short growing seasons, and unpredictable weather patterns were unlike anything they had experienced in Europe. Yet despite these obstacles, wheat cultivation became a key part of Canada's agricultural identity. In the early days, the wheat grown was often winter wheat, a hardier variety that could withstand the harsh Canadian winters. Farmers carefully selected fields with the best soil conditions, as soil health was paramount to a good harvest. With time, they discovered which regions in Canada were best suited for wheat cultivation, such as parts of Ontario and the prairies, which would later become the breadbasket of Canada. Farmers quickly realized that in order to make the most out of their wheat harvest, they needed to make every grain count. As a result, they developed methods of saving and reusing wheat in innovative ways. The grain was not only used for bread, a staple food, but also for other purposes like animal feed, and even making wheat-based alcohol like beer and whiskey. Nothing was wasted, and this mindset would become ingrained in the Canadian agricultural ethos. One key practice that developed was the use of wheat straw. After the wheat was harvested, the leftover straw wasn't discarded. It was used for various purposes. Some farmers would use it as bedding for animals, others would burn it for fuel, and many would compost it to enrich the soil for the next planting season. This efficient use of resources ensured that nothing went to waste and the soil was kept fertile for the years to come. As the 19th century progressed, the practices surrounding wheat farming in Canada became increasingly efficient and resourceful. The early settlers and farmers understood that their very survival depended on making every grain count, and this philosophy permeated every step of wheat cultivation, from planting to harvesting and beyond. One of the most important methods that Canadians adopted was crop rotation. By rotating wheat with other crops, like barley, oats, and legumes, farmers ensured that the soil remained fertile and productive. Growing the same crop year after year would deplete the soil of essential nutrients, but rotating crops allowed the soil to regenerate and reduce the need for expensive fertilizers. This method was a key part of the conservation mindset. By preserving the land's ability to yield crops, farmers ensured a long-term, sustainable source of wheat. Harvesting. Wheat was also a labor-intensive process, and every effort was made to extract as much as possible. Threshing, the process of separating the grain from the chaff, was done manually at first, using hand tools like flails. This was back-breaking work, but the precision and care taken ensured that very little wheat was lost. Once the grain was separated, it was sifted and cleaned, and any leftover wheat was either used for seed the following year or ground into flour for consumption. In the community, wheat was seen not just as food, but as a symbol of self-sufficiency. The ability to grow wheat and other essential crops represented a farmer's independence from outside sources, especially as transportation was difficult and expensive. Early Canadians knew that by producing their own wheat, they could not only feed their families, but also contribute to the local economy by trading surplus grain with nearby settlements. This trade network was crucial to the development of Canada's agricultural industry. Another remarkable practice was the preservation of wheat seeds. Farmers were careful to select and save the best seeds from their harvest, ensuring that the next year's crops would be strong and resilient. By keeping seeds from their own harvests, they created a cycle of self-reliance, which meant that their wheat production was always optimized for the local environment. This practice of saving and sharing seeds also fostered a strong sense of community among settlers, who often exchanged seeds and knowledge about farming techniques. The rise of the gristmill was another innovation that transformed the way Canadians used wheat. Instead of milling grain by hand, which was a time-consuming task, farmers could take their wheat to a local gristmill, where it was ground into flour for baking. The flour was then used not only for bread, but for other food products like pancakes, cakes, and pastries. This process allowed for greater efficiency in the use of wheat, ensuring that even small amounts could be converted into a variety of food products. With the introduction of larger, more industrialized wheat farms in the 20th century, did these traditional methods of conservation become obsolete? How did the shift toward mechanization impact the values of resourcefulness and sustainability that were so important to early Canadians? By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Canada's agricultural practices began to shift as technology advanced and mechanization took hold. Tractors, combines, and large-scale industrial farming methods started to replace the manual labor that had once characterized Canadian farming, including the meticulous care taken to preserve every grain of wheat. This shift marked the beginning of a new era for Canadian wheat farming, one that would eventually make Canada one of the largest wheat exporters in the world. Despite the rapid industrialization of agriculture, the lessons learned from the early days of wheat farming continued to resonate. The resourcefulness, conservation, and deep connection to the land that early Canadians practiced were not entirely lost. In fact, many modern Canadian farmers continue to incorporate sustainable practices into their operations, recognizing the value of soil health and crop rotation to ensure the long-term viability of their land. One of the most significant legacies of early Canadian wheat farming is Canada's continued role as a global leader in wheat production. The Canadian prairies, particularly regions in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, have become some of the most productive wheat-growing areas in the world. The country's wheat industry plays a critical role in the national economy, with millions of tons of wheat being exported annually to countries around the world. While the methods may have evolved, the values of hard work, sustainability, and respect for the land remain central to Canadian agriculture. Modern Canadian wheat farmers continue to rely on crop rotation, soil preservation, and the careful selection of seeds to maintain the quality of their crops. Additionally, Canada's commitment to sustainable farming practices has grown, with initiatives focusing on reducing carbon footprints, using fewer pesticides, and increasing the efficiency of irrigation systems. The use of wheat in Canadian society has also evolved. It is no longer just a simple staple food. It has become part of Canada's cultural fabric. Wheat is found not only in the bread we eat, but also in the growing craft beer industry, where wheat varieties are used to make beer, and in various other food products. The value of wheat extends beyond its ability to feed people. It is a symbol of Canada's agricultural history and its resilience in the face of challenges. Looking back on the history of wheat farming in Canada, it's clear that the resilience and resourcefulness of early settlers have left a lasting impact. While the methods may have evolved, the core principles of sustainability and respect for the land continue to guide Canadian farmers today. How can modern agricultural industries balance technological advancements with the values of conservation and sustainability that were so important to the early pioneers? In the early days of Canadian settlement, survival was a constant struggle, and settlers had to rely on the land around them to provide not only food, but also remedies for illnesses and injuries. One of the most important, though often overlooked, resources was mushrooms. For Indigenous peoples, mushrooms had long been a part of their medicinal practices, and early settlers learned from them the many ways these fungi could be used to treat ailments. The forests of Canada, particularly in the temperate regions, are home to a wide variety of mushrooms, some of which have powerful medicinal properties. The Indigenous peoples had a deep understanding of the natural world and knew which mushrooms could be used for medicinal purposes. For example, certain mushrooms were used to treat wounds, digestive issues, and even infections. The chaga mushroom, known for its potent antioxidant properties, was used by Indigenous groups for its healing abilities, and reishi mushrooms, revered in traditional medicine, were used for their immune-boosting effects. When European settlers arrived, they brought with them their own herbal traditions, but were initially unfamiliar with the local flora. It didn't take long, however, before they began to recognize the value of the mushrooms growing in the Canadian forests. The settlers were often taught by Indigenous healers how to properly identify and use the various mushrooms for medicinal purposes. One particularly important lesson that settlers learned from Indigenous peoples was the use of mushrooms to treat infections and wounds. During the early days of settlement, access to modern medicine and antibiotics was limited, and injuries were often treated with herbal remedies, including the use of specific mushrooms known for their antibacterial and antifungal properties. For example, the turkey tail mushroom, which grows abundantly in Canada, was used as a treatment for respiratory ailments, coughs, and even for its potential to boost the immune system. In addition to their healing properties, mushrooms also played an important role in the diet. Many edible varieties, like the chanterelle and morel mushrooms, were harvested for their nutritional value, contributing to the settlers' sustenance during long winters. These mushrooms were not only delicious, but packed with essential vitamins and minerals. Unresolved thought question: how did settlers integrate these Indigenous practices into their own healthcare systems? And what challenges did they face in understanding and using mushrooms as medicine? Were there misunderstandings or conflicts between Indigenous knowledge and European medicinal traditions? As European settlers began to recognize the potential of mushrooms as medicinal resources, they started to incorporate them into their own health practices. However, Integrating these natural remedies into their established European medical systems was not without challenges. The settlers were used to the more familiar herbal remedies and potions from their homeland, and were often skeptical of local, unfamiliar treatments. Indigenous peoples, however, had a long history of using mushrooms in their healing practices, and they were more than willing to share their knowledge. Indigenous healers taught settlers how to properly identify medicinal mushrooms, which ones could be used safely, and how to prepare them for maximum benefit. This exchange of knowledge was critical in bridging the gap between European settlers and the indigenous peoples they encountered. The settlers soon realized that mushrooms could be used for a wide range of ailments, from respiratory infections to digestive disorders. One of the mushrooms that gained significant attention among settlers was the reishi mushroom, Ganoderma lucidum, known for its immune-boosting properties. Indigenous groups had used it for centuries, and settlers adopted it for its medicinal qualities, especially in treating chronic conditions. Reishi was believed to have anti-inflammatory effects, which helped with conditions like arthritis, and it also played a role in enhancing overall vitality and health. In the absence of conventional medical treatments, the settlers turned to these mushrooms as a remedy for common illnesses. The settlers also learned about the chaga mushroom, a nutrient-dense fungus that grows on birch trees. Chaga was particularly valued for its high levels of antioxidants and its ability to support the immune system. It was used as a tea to fight colds and other respiratory infections, as well as for its purported cancer-fighting properties. While the settlers initially viewed the practice with some skepticism, the long-term success of these mushroom-based remedies began to change their perceptions, especially as they saw positive results in treating illnesses that would have otherwise been difficult to manage. Mushrooms were not just used for medicinal purposes. They were also valuable in the preparation of everyday foods. As settlers began to incorporate them into their diets, they discovered that they were a great source of nutrition, especially during the long winters when fresh produce was scarce. Mushrooms like the morel and chanterelle became highly prized for their flavor and were often included in stews, soups, and other hearty meals. As more settlers adopted these practices, the use of mushrooms became more widespread, and they eventually found their place in the growing herbal medicine market. By the late 19th century, mushrooms like reishi and chaga were being sold in herbal shops in cities like Montreal and Toronto, further integrating these natural remedies into Canadian culture. Unresolved thought question: how did the commercial demand for medicinal mushrooms impact the way settlers and later Canadians managed their forests and land? Did the growing interest in mushrooms as a commodity lead to overharvesting or the development of sustainable mushroom collection practices? By the 20th century, as Canada's medical practices became more modernized with the advent of pharmaceuticals and advanced healthcare, the role of mushrooms in Canadian medicine gradually faded. However, the historical significance of mushrooms in early Canadian health practices did not disappear entirely. In fact, it experienced a resurgence in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as people began to rediscover the benefits of natural, plant-based remedies and the holistic practices of previous generations. As interest in alternative and complementary medicine grew, so too did the recognition of mushrooms like reishi, chaga, and turkey tail for their medicinal properties. Scientific research began to confirm many of the benefits that indigenous peoples and early settlers had known intuitively for centuries. Mushrooms were found to contain compounds that boosted the immune system, reduced inflammation, and had even potential cancer-fighting properties. As a result, many of these mushrooms were commercialized in the form of supplements, teas, and tinctures, gaining popularity as part of the broader wellness movement. In addition to their health benefits, mushrooms also continued to be an important part of Canadian culture. The forests of Canada particularly in regions like British Columbia and Ontario, remained home to a wide variety of edible and medicinal mushrooms, and foragers began to return to the woods, harvesting mushrooms as a part of their outdoor lifestyle. The growing interest in wild food foraging helped re-establish a connection to the land that early settlers had relied upon for survival. The resurgence of interest in mushrooms as medicine also brought attention to the importance of sustainable foraging. In the past, as the demand for medicinal mushrooms increased, there was a risk of over-harvesting, particularly of slow-growing species like chaga. However, with growing awareness of the environmental impacts of such practices, there has been a push toward more sustainable harvesting methods. Regulations were introduced to ensure that mushrooms were collected in a way that allowed the forest ecosystems to regenerate, ensuring that future generations could continue to benefit from these natural resources. In modern times, Canadian researchers have played a key role in studying the medicinal properties of mushrooms, particularly the potential uses of psilocybin mushrooms in mental health treatment. The research into psychedelic-assisted therapy has been gaining traction in Canada, with clinical trials showing promising results for conditions such as depression, PTSD, and anxiety. The exploration of these psychedelic properties marks a new chapter in the historical use of mushrooms in Canada, linking the past knowledge of Indigenous peoples and early settlers to cutting-edge research in mental health care. The legacy of mushrooms in Canada's medical history is both rich and evolving. From their use by Indigenous peoples and early settlers to their resurgence in modern health practices, mushrooms have played a significant role in shaping Canadian culture and medicine. As we look ahead, how can we ensure that this valuable resource is protected while continuing to explore its potential in both traditional and modern medicine? The idea of building a transcontinental railroad in Canada was a grand vision that would unite a vast and diverse country stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For early Canadians, the construction of a railroad wasn't just about transportation. It was about connecting isolated regions, facilitating trade, and forging a sense of national unity in a country spread across vast, rugged terrain. The dream was to link the Canadian East with the West, opening up new opportunities for settlement and economic growth. The first steps toward this dream were taken in the 1840s, when Canada's leaders recognized the need for a national transportation system. At the time, travel across the country was slow and difficult. Settlers in the West were isolated, and trade between the East and West was limited to arduous travel by horse, boat, and the occasional wagon train. The journey from Ontario to British Columbia, for example, could take months, and the lack of efficient transportation systems hampered the development of Canada's economy. The idea of a transcontinental railroad was first proposed by politicians and businessmen who recognized that building a railway would provide a faster, safer, and more reliable means of transportation. It would also serve as a key element in the expansion of Canada into the West. The government saw the railroad as essential for encouraging settlement and for securing Canada's territorial claims over the vast and largely uninhabited western frontier. By 1867, the dream began to take shape with the Confederation of Canada, and the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, became one of the nation's most ambitious projects. However, building a national railroad was not without its challenges. The natural landscape was rugged and difficult to navigate, especially in the Rocky Mountains. The task of laying tracks through such treacherous terrain required not only vast resources, but also immense labor, ingenuity, and time. Early surveys of the land were difficult, and finding a path for the railway that would be both efficient and feasible proved to be a monumental task. Unresolved. Thought question. What were some of the initial challenges faced by the engineers and workers tasked with building the railroad? How did these early difficulties shape the eventual design and construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Building the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, was not just a feat of engineering. It was a Herculean struggle that tested the resolve of the nation. The railway was a project of unprecedented scale, and its construction would require overcoming numerous obstacles, from the difficult terrain to labor shortages and extreme weather conditions. Despite these challenges, the construction of the CPR was driven by a powerful sense of urgency and national pride. The most formidable challenge faced by the workers was the Rocky Mountains. The mountain range, with its towering peaks and deep ravines, posed an immense challenge to engineers trying to lay tracks through such a harsh landscape. The Kicking Horse Pass, for instance, required the construction of a series of tunnels and bridges that would become one of the most difficult sections of the railway. The project's engineers, including some of the brightest minds of the time, struggled to find a route that could accommodate the heavy trains and connect the East with the West. In addition to the physical challenges, the project faced logistical problems such as supply shortages. The labor force, which included thousands of workers, was often under-equipped, and resources like timber and stone were in limited supply. To meet the needs of the growing workforce, makeshift camps were established along the route, often in remote locations. Workers endured long hours, back-breaking labor, and difficult living conditions. Many were from diverse backgrounds, including Chinese laborers, who were brought in to help with the most difficult and dangerous tasks. They worked tirelessly, constructing sections of track through the mountains, often at great personal cost. The Chinese workers, in particular, faced harsh discrimination and were paid lower wages than their European counterparts, yet their contributions were critical to the railway's completion. In some regions, the construction of the railway was delayed by the harsh Canadian winters. Snow and ice frequently halted progress, and workers faced the constant threat of avalanches and frostbite. Despite these setbacks, the project continued, driven by both the promise of economic growth and the political necessity of uniting the country. Throughout the journey, engineers and workers used innovative techniques, including dynamite to blast through rock and bridges that spanned across rivers and valleys. By 1885, after nearly 10 years of relentless effort, the final spike of the railway was driven into the ground at Promontory Summit in British Columbia, marking the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The success of the CPR was a momentous achievement for Canada, symbolizing the nation's ability to overcome enormous challenges and unite its vast and distant territories. Unresolved thought question: how did the completion of the CPR affect the indigenous peoples who lived along its route? What were the long-term consequences of the railroad's expansion for the land, the people, and the environment? The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, in 1885 marked a turning point in Canada's history. Not only did it unite the country from coast to coast, but it also opened up vast tracts of land for settlement, trade, and resource extraction. The railway transformed Canada into a more cohesive nation, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and ideas across its expansive geography. However, while the CPR was a triumph for many, it also had significant and lasting consequences for the indigenous peoples and the environment. For settlers and businesses, the CPR provided a lifeline to the West. The ability to travel across the country in a matter of days rather than months revolutionized trade, allowing goods to be shipped from the prairies and forests of Western Canada to markets in the East and beyond. The railway also encouraged large-scale settlement in previously uninhabited areas, particularly the prairies, which became known as the breadbasket of Canada. By linking the vast agricultural regions of Western Canada with major markets in Eastern Canada and internationally, the CPR helped fuel Canada's growing economy, creating jobs and driving the development of cities and towns along its route. For the Canadian government, the CPR was also a political victory. When Canada was founded in 1867, the provinces of British Columbia and Ontario were wary of joining a confederation that seemed disconnected and distant. The promise of the railway was one of the key factors that convinced British Columbia to join Canada, and the completion of the CPR ensured the territorial unity of the nation. Without the railway, Canada's farthest reaches may have remained isolated from the rest of the country, and the notion of a unified nation could have been significantly weakened. However, the construction of the railway had significant, often devastating, effects on Indigenous peoples. Many Indigenous communities lived along the railway's proposed route, and their lands were encroached upon by settlers, as well as the railway itself. The displacement of these communities and the destruction of their traditional ways of life were the result of the railway's expansion. Indigenous peoples who had once travelled freely across the land found their access to resources, such as hunting grounds and fishing areas, severely restricted. Additionally, the influx of settlers and new diseases introduced by Europeans led to a dramatic decline in indigenous populations. As settlers moved westward along the railroad, the government implemented policies that sought to assimilate indigenous peoples, forcing them into reserves and attempting to erase their cultural practices. The creation of residential schools designed to civilize indigenous children was a direct consequence of the expansion of the railway and the settlement of the West. The environmental impact of the CPR's construction also cannot be overlooked. The building of the railway led to widespread deforestation, particularly in British Columbia, where vast forests were cleared to make way for the tracks. The construction itself caused significant damage to the natural landscape, as dynamite was used to blast through mountains and tunnels were dug through the earth. While the railway opened up vast areas for resource extraction, it also altered the environment in ways that are still felt today. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway was a remarkable achievement that helped shape the nation, but it also came at a great cost. For the settlers, the CPR was a symbol of progress, but for the Indigenous peoples and the environment, it marked the beginning of a period of immense disruption. How do we reconcile the legacy of the CPR's contribution to Canada's development with the profound negative impacts it had on the land and its original inhabitants?